very, very pleased that the first lecture in this series is on a topic that few Americans know much about, Yemen. A country that suffers immensely, a country that's in a war, a proxy war between Saudi Arabia, Iran, Saudi allies, and Iranian allies as well, and where the suffering is incredible. I don't know if you follow it all in the newspapers. I'm not a Middle East expert, but I try to read about it as much as I can. And we've never done anything on Yemen before. So this is a first, and we're very fortunate. We have one of the relatively few experts on that nation in the United States. Jillian Schwedler earned her BA in Near Eastern Studies, Languages and Literature at New York University, along with her MA in Middle Eastern Studies and a PhD in Politics, all at NYU. She currently teaches in the Political Science Department at City University and has spent a good deal of time in Yemen, other parts of the Middle East, has published a number of scholarly articles, including Islamists in Power, The Political Geography of Protest in Jordan, Can Islamists Become Moderates? An interesting question. Faith in Moderation, and a range of other articles dealing with Jordan, Yemen, et cetera, countries in the Middle East. So I'm so very, very pleased. But something happened. Jillian got here early, and she was sitting waiting for us. Unfortunately, I didn't provide the best directions, and so Jillian sat here for about an hour and a half, and finally, we found her. So Jillian, thank you very much for coming, and thank you for your patience. Yeah. So anyway. Save your questions for after her talk, and I have asked Jillian to repeat your questions to make sure that everybody hears.
Thank you. Thanks so much. It's funny that I lived in Yemen for so many years, and there's no street signs, and I made my way around fine, and I get lost like in the lobby, 100 feet from this auditorium somehow. So it's hardly your fault. So thank you so much for coming out, and thank you for caring about Yemen. As I mentioned, it's a moment ago to Jack, I lived in Yemen for many years in the 90s, and I care a great deal about the country. And I think because there's so much happening in the region that a lot of Americans just have conflict fatigue and can't keep up with what's going on. And here's another conflict, and I don't get it. There's too much, to understand. And there's not too much to understand, and I'm happy that you guys have come out to sort of learn it. It's, a particular story that's not as familiar as some of the countries we hear more regularly about, Egypt and Iran, et cetera. But I'm going to do my best to sort of explain what the conflict is going on there right now. It is a terrible civil war, 26 to 27 million people in the country. Multiple foreign governments are involved in the war, and UN has declared about 80% of the population in desperate need, and about half the population in an immediate crisis. The country is going to run out of water in the next few years. It is very close to being out of water now. So without the war, it's just an absolutely devastating circumstance. Having said that, it's not that nothing could be done. And so I want to sort of explain what's going on with the conflict there, give you a little background, and then we can talk about some possibilities for some things that could be done a bit differently. How do I page down? Oh. Okay. So Yemen is located on the southwest corner of the Arabian Peninsula. It is a really diverse country with very rugged mountain highlands, rolling desert, Tihama Plain along the Red Sea that's very lush and fertile. So parts of it have waterfalls, although those are diminishing, and the water is not actually potable due to a lot of the ground runoff from chemicals and other kinds of things. So there's a lot to deal with. The ground itself, here's a map of, did I skip one too fast? No. Why does this say end of slideshow? All right, let me try. It says 29 slides. There we go. Okay. So, This is Yemen. Yemen was never united until 1990. Prior to that, in the 60s, you had North and South Yemen, which before that were never entirely united. So the area is called the Yemen, or Yemen, but it was never entirely united. Most of Yemen, most of the population, is located from Sana'a, this sort of north-south corridor, down to Aden. That's the mountain ranges, that's where what water exists is there. When you get out here, there's a few, I'll show you a few oasis towns, but otherwise it's just vast, arid desert. So you have the population concentrated in this one area. In the mountaintops, you have these incredibly beautiful towns, which served as fortress towns up until the early part of the 20th century. They were very remote, hard to get to, and very effective as fortifications until, of course, the invention of the airplane, in which case you just fly over and bomb them, and they cease to be as useful. But they're still inhabited, and they're quite spectacularly beautiful, even as they're hard to get to. This is a road from the mountain. The highlands are about 7,500 feet above sea level, which is where the capital of Sana'a is. And there are very rugged mountains, and this is one of the better maintained roads to get down. This will become important when we'll talk about, near the end of my talk, the standoff between the group that holds the highlands right now and the group that's trying to take the highlands. Because it's very difficult to move heavy armory up these kinds of roads. And if you do, and you're at the high position, you can easily just bomb down on them, destroy the road. So the campaigns are largely aerial campaigns right now. But we're at a standoff, in part because the geography of the country is so difficult to access the highlands. Okay, so a little bit of background. Before the 1960s, Yemen, as I said, Yemen was not united. And here you can see the red is what's considered North Yemen. The green is considered East Yemen. The green goes northern more than North Yemen does. But because primarily it was the north-south corridor, that had an easy north-south piece to it. So these were basically two different clusters of peoples controlling them. In the north was a Zaydi Shia dynasty, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute because that comes up in the conflict today. Sometimes you'll hear portrayals of the conflict as being a Sunni Shia conflict or a proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And so I'm going to complicate that a little bit. So this Zaydi dynasty is over 1,000 years old and ruled in the north up until the early 60s, which I'll talk about. The Ottomans controlled parts of Yemen during the Ottoman Empire, basically along the Red Sea, because all they really cared about was shipping route. But then the second main force was in Yemen until the 60s was Aden, which became a British colony in 1839. And so here's the Queen. This is in the 30s in Aden. And the colony, as you see, the port of Aden is down there. It's the last major shipping stop when you go up the Red Sea. And so this is before even the Suez is open. And when the Suez Canal is open in the 1860s, Aden is even more important as a port. So the British basically control Aden and the greater Aden area. So this green picture of this territory is kind of a misnomer. Everything outside of greater Aden is completely autonomous. So in the north, you have the Imam dynasty in the highlands, but people on the coast are different. There's people more inland, also have some autonomy. So it's never, ever been completely united. And it's a very heavily, through the 20th century up till today, a very heavily armed country. By some counts, it's the most heavily armed country on the planet. In 2009, this is the last good estimate I have, because there's no government there now, the Ministry of the Interior estimated at the time the population was 23 million, and there were over 60 million weapons in private hands, and that's counting children. That's of the whole population. Right? So it's very heavily armed. There's all kinds of smuggling in and out. And so you have these clusters, these sort of tribal groups in different areas that are fairly well armed, and they defend their own land against others. This, again, will be an important piece of the story when we get to the war that's happening now, because when the war did break out, you had essentially militias all over the country, some of which became involved in the war and took sides, some of which are like, we're sitting out and don't cross our territory, we don't want anything to do with this. So, but this goes back quite a long period of time. And then this Eastern process, province out here, which I said where is arid, has 3 main towns in it. It's called the Hadramaut area. This town is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's called Shibam, and it is, has 8- and 9-story mud brick buildings with no steel infrastructure, and they're maintained till this day. I was very lucky to get to visit on several occasions. It's spectacularly beautiful. But that's way out and really disconnected. The British never had any control over that, and they've been disconnected to the Imamate in the highlands. They see themselves as very different people. In fact, the accent in Arabic is very, very different from place to place because they existed not without connections with each other, but fairly autonomously. Okay, so back to this question of who are these Zaydis? And I'm going to spend just a minute here because, again, it's going to be important for understanding what's happening now, and particularly the rhetoric that this is an Iranian-backed militant group in the north fighting the authentic people of the south, or the Saudi-Iran proxy. So the main division in Islam is more complicated than often made out. It had to do with passing of a rule. Once Muhammad died, the Prophet Muhammad died, who was going to rule the community? And most of the community accepted what were called the 4 rightly guided caliphs. And these were 4 people from the community, no relationship to the Prophet. They were just chosen by the other members of the community, of course the male members of the community, to lead the community. And those 4, people often point to those as an example of the democratic roots of Islam, that very early in Islam there was this process of we as a community are going to choose who's going to rule us next. The 4th of those was a guy named Ali. And Ali actually had a bunch of people that thought from the very beginning he should have gotten to rule next after Muhammad. He was the nephew of Muhammad, and he married Muhammad's daughter, Fatima. So this group that thought that he should follow, in Arabic, they're called the partisans of Ali, or the followers of Ali. And in Arabic, it's Shi'at Alis, which is where we get the term Shiites. So the Shiites were the people that thought that Ali should be the next in line. So you don't have to, this is just a lineage from Muhammad is at the top, and this line down the middle, this is the different imams, the first caliph, those 4 rightly guided caliphs you see come from the community, except for Ali, who is the nephew. So Shiites believe, yes, we follow the Quran and Muhammad and everything, just like the mainstream of the community, the Sunni, which is the mainstream. But you also have to follow these leaders, these imams, up until the 12th imam, who has in occultation, he's disappeared from the earth. He's going to come back on Judgment Day, but he's gone. He's not dead, he's just gone. So these are these a line of 12 imams down to the 12th imam, Mahdi, who will one day return. This is the line of Shiism that exists, the mainstream Shiism that most Shias follow, and it's the line of Shiism that's the one in Iran. Until this conflict a few years ago, Iran treated the Zaydis as heretics. Like they didn't see them as Shias the way they're talked about today as Shias. Why is that? The reason is because at the 5th Imam, this community in Yemen thought that the mainstream of these 2 brothers, that they were following the wrong one. The brother they should have been followed was Zayd. So Zaydi is where they get their name, the followers of Zayd. Or they're called fivers, because they break off at the 5th Imam. You also have 7ers, 11ers. People break off at different points. And so this whole Shia as a single category is actually a lot more complicated than that. But there's a conventional othering when it's like Shias are under attack, Shias kind of identified together. The Zaydis also adopted a lot of the mainstream Shia jurisprudence from one of the schools. And so they were seen as like completely heretical. They weren't Shia enough, and they were following too much of this Sunni thought. Okay, so we'll bracket that. So, jumping to independence. So, we have a colony in the south, and you have this imamate in the north, and all these other little armed groups. In the early 60s, so in Gamal Abdel Nasser, who you see in 1952 with other officers in Egypt, overthrow the monarchy in the name of Arab nationalism and create a republican state in Egypt. A lot of these officers working for the imamate in North Yemen really liked this Arab nationalist idea. And in 1962, with Nasser's support, they launch a coup against the imam. The older imam died, and the son came to power, and they thought this was an opportune moment. So this war goes on for several years. These are the officers and Nasser. And on this side, the fellow in the middle is the new imam who's been overthrown. And you have the Saudi king, Jordan, and that is a British officer, kind of gone native, living in Yemen. And they're going to support the imamate. The context of this is, the Arab nationalist rise and the overthrowing of kings. 1958, the Iraqi monarchy is overthrown and they're all massacred. And the Republicans come to power. So this is something that's happening throughout the region, and it starts to happen in Yemen. Why am I spending a moment on this? I'm spending a moment on this because this gentleman, the new imam, Ahmed, is a Zaydi dynasty. And Jordan and Saudi Arabia are Sunni. And it's not a problem. Nobody cares that they're from different branches of Islam. In this case, it's more monarchs who feel threatened and Republicans who want to overthrow the monarchs. Saudi Arabia is actually involved in Yemen pretty consistently with all kinds of different groups up until today. But they don't have any problems with working with Zaydis, and we'll see this going through. They have all kinds of alliances with Zaydis. And so this rhetoric that's emerged recently that the Zaydis are this big threat is a selling point to mobilize people. Saudi Arabia has been very involved and has, in fact, at certain points, funded Northerners, funded Southerners against each other. It's really tried to just have its hands in Yemen to build its own support base and get what it wants done. I'm going to go to the next slide and take a drink of water. So we have these two countries that are both coming into being. The British colony is overthrown in 1967, peacefully. Basically, they're going to mount an opposition, and Britain decides it's going to withdraw. So they become independent for the first time, and the North tries to unify all these different tribes, and the South is trying to unify these different groups. Beginning in 1970, the South Yemen, which is called the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen, is looking for a client, and it finds a client in the Soviet Union. So there's a Marxist state in South Yemen from 1970 up until 1990. Because Aden is developed as a British colony, has a great port infrastructure, the education of women, it's way ahead of much of the region, and certainly miles ahead of northern Yemen. In the north, you have this Republican government, not democratic at all, but it goes about trying to consolidate power. But they're not able to really control all these different tribal groups, so a lot of it's done through working with them. Like, hey, we'll do something for you guys over here, you don't overthrow us, but we're not going to step on your territory too much. So it was always kind of a loose coalition, never the way when we think of a sovereign state where the single army controls everything on a sovereign piece of territory. It's never functioned like that, even after unification. So these two countries unify in 1990. And one of the reasons they unify, well, the North is in need of, it wants, very much like to access that lovely port and have some economic benefits from that. There's some oil discovered, and they also want to kind of figure out who's going to be able to benefit from that. But significantly, the southern benefit, since 1990 unified, if you think of what happened in 1989, the collapse of the Soviet Union means they lost their client. And they lost a tremendous amount of resources. So for the South, it was a gamble. We'll take on this much larger populated North, but this can be better for us to strengthen ourselves as a united country. A few years later, very quickly, it seems clear that Ali Abdullah Saleh, who's the man on the left, has no intention actually of really sharing power. They do have a wonderfully free election in 1993. Foreign observers were invited in, and it was certified wildly free and fair, and returned a really diverse assembly. No single party won a majority, so it was like lots of independents. However, Ali Abdullah Saleh really does want to sort of take over, And so from the south, they're starting to realize that he's, with a larger population and a stronger army, he's really sort of maneuvering to take over. So in late 1993, after the elections, and early 1994, there's some talk of succession, that the South is going to succeed again because it's not working out so well. This matters significantly because a guy named Abdurrabbu Mansour al-Hadi, so Hadi, who's from the South, actually fights in that war for Ali Abdullah Saleh on his side. That'll matter significantly in a minute, that he's a Southerner fighting for the North. So Saleh is basically effective. There's a war in 1994 that goes for 2 months. Ali Salim al-Baib is exiled. Saudi Arabia supports which side in the war? Both sides, right? It doesn't want a strong, united Yemen. In fact, it funds Ali Salim al-Baib to go to Lebanon at some point. So he's funding socialists, they're funding leftists, and at the same time, they're also sending their own, what effectively are sort of missionaries, this sort of very conservative, this sort of Wahhabi Islam, this brand of Sunni Islam that's very, very conservative and very alien to the Zaydis and the Shafi'is, which are the Sunnis in the south. They're coming, bringing this very conservative brand, and that's seen as kind of hostilely. Like, who are these people? Why is Saudi Arabia involved here? But different tribal groups are taking money from Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is paying off different people. When I was there was a joke. I was first there in 1994, right after the war. There was a joke that if Saudi Arabia wasn't trying to pay you off, then you were nobody. So you better be trying to get it paid off, because that means you were somebody of importance. And it didn't matter. Everybody knew that Saudi Arabia was paying everybody off, trying to keep it fragmented. Okay, so I'm going to jump forward, although this history is incredibly interesting, to me anyways. Come into the 2000s. So Ali Abdullah Saleh has solidified control. There's still socialists there, the Yemeni Socialist Party, but those old leaders have effectively all gone. But there's still a succession movement in the South, right? There's strong, especially around the younger crowd, like we need to end this unification and have an independent South. At the same time, in the North, you have this group, a tribe called the Houthis, who are a Zaydi tribe. Right? And they are very frustrated. They're heavily armed, as much of the country is. They're very frustrated that Ali Abdullah Saleh is allowing Saudi Arabia to open all these schools of Wahhabi learning, particularly in their neighborhoods and communities. So they're really resentful. So there becomes this sort of Zaydi pride movement. And the Houthis are advocates of sort of retaking, elevating the place of Zaydi Islam in the community. I should bracket to say Ali Abdullah Saleh is a Zaydi himself, right? But he's a power grabber. He's just a politician. So he's actually fighting Zaydi. So this is sort of Zaydi violence. But calling it Zaydi violence is irrelevant because it's not what it's about. It's about the sort of government trying to assert control against this Houthis, which is the name of the tribe, who want some more autonomy in the north, and they want the Saudi schools out. Like, you need to get them out of here. So it escalates in a series of wars. Several of the Houthi gentlemen from the tribe, who are their leaders, are killed. But there's kind of this standoff, and here we go back a little bit to the terrain, right? It's very difficult to move from one to the other to the other. There's very few roads that are secure. So there's a lot of bombing. Saudi Arabia comes in, some of them near the end in 2009 and 2010. Although Jordan has an air force, it's not nearly as spiffy as Saudi Arabia's is, because Saudi Arabia's got the latest stuff from the United States, and Yemen's a very poor country. So Saudi Arabia comes in to help bomb the Houthis. This is the beginning of this narrative of the Houthi, the Shia rising. Even though he's helping these other Zaydis on behalf of crushing these Zaydis, the Houthi Zaydis over here, right? Again, this is just a lot of this is really politics. It's masked in religious rhetoric, but it's just power, old school power politics. So not long after that last big pummeling, we have the Arab uprisings in 2011, and Yemen had an uprising. You may know Tuwakil Karman, who won the Nobel Peace Prize with 2 other women that year, was a big personality and voice in it. In January, they start to protest, and the Houthis, who have opposed the government, now join the protesters as anti-government demonstrators. because they were against the government anyways. But now instead of being rebels, they're like, no, we're anti-government demonstrators. But they bring and they provide some tents and resources for the protesters. An elaborate infrastructure emerges pretty quickly. On March 18th, Saleh decides that he's going to crack down and just, we don't like the way this is going. You have to remember the Egypt government's fallen, the Tunisian government's fallen, Syria's starting to heat up, and he's like, enough of this. When he does so, and this is a classic thing that leads to civil wars, the military is not united behind him. The military splits. And part of the military is going to defend the protesters, and part of the military follows him loyally. Ali Mohsen, who I mentioned, breaks with the protesters, is also Zaidi, and he's actually a cousin of the president, Ali Abdullah Saleh. Right? So now you have Zaidis again on all sides. This gentleman, Ali Mohsen, is now fighting on the side that's fighting the Zaidis in the north as Zaidis, right? So it's still, from a distance, it looks clearer. June, there's a mosque bomb, and Ali Abdullah Saleh he's almost killed, and he's flown to Saudi Arabia for medical treatment. Everybody thinks he's not coming back in the country, but he actually sneaks back into the country without Saudi Arabia's permission, and he lands back in the country. But now, and here's the vice president is Abdurrabbu Mansour al-Hadi that I mentioned, who is a southerner who is always allied with the north. Right, so he is now he's the vice president, so we're going to get rid of so he's going to be the acting president if and when Saleh eventually goes. Okay. By the summer, it's still incredibly fragmented. So you have protesters, but they're not entirely united. There's different opposition groups. Some are saying we can have a future Yemen without Saleh, and some are saying, no, he can stay, just in a diminished role. So there's lots of disagreements. And again, lots of foreign groups, including Saudi Arabia, that are pushing for things to go one way or another. Again, there's incredibly high weapons in people's hands. And at the bottom, so with this collapse of the state, which was never very strong, a lot of different groups were able to make gains over these months. So the Houthis could expand their reach. Al-Qaeda, which exists, it's Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, also could step into some areas. They've always been there, but they found sort of pockets with not a lot of other powers, and they could come in and say, oh, my brother, and we have resources, and we can help rebuild for you and fix your generator. So they saw some immediate gains. And again, these various military connections. And you still have this Southern secession movement, right? So they're all about overthrowing Ali Abdullah Saleh, but they want independence. This is in the summer. Coming out of the summer, and this is where you see the strong hand of foreign powers. The Gulf Cooperation Council, which is the Gulf-producing oil states, propose this transition document called the GCC Initiative. And they propose that Ali Abdullah Saleh will step down, but he'll be immune from prosecution. Hadi will become president in February by election, but he'll be the only candidate. So it's really going to be a referendum. And in this process, this is an external document from external groups that come in and say, here's the solution for you in your country. And all the protesters and youth groups are basically completely shut out of this process. So tremendous outrage at this. However, it does move forward. And Hadi is, in fact, elected by referendum, and here he is. So he's elected in February of 2012. A year later, because of so much outrage, he says, we're going to have a national dialogue conference, which is like, oh, yes, all you people can come, and we'll have a big conversation. We'll decide together what is going to be Yemen's future. However, he also creates a presidential council, and then soon thereafter says the presidential council is the only decision-making body. This national committee is just a consultative body, which everybody sees exactly what's happening. It's just consolidating power. And so he gives the presidential body, and it's dominated by the GPC, which I didn't mention, but that's the former party of Saleh, of which he was a part. So essentially saying now post-uprising Yemen is going to be controlled by the same party that controlled it before. And even, guess who's the chair of that party after he steps down as president? Is Ali Abdullah Saleh. So he's still in politics. So you can imagine people are really outraged. They're like, really? This is what we had this moment? This is what's going to come for us? So there's all kinds of frustration. Hadi has a 2-year term he was only elected for, but then he extends it when it expires in 2014. Says, I'm going to have 2 more years by presidential degree. And that fall is where we see the slide into war. So the first key issue that happens is the Houthis march on Sana'a. They're coming down from the north, and they're like, we've had it. We see what's happening. This guy Hadi is going to take over with Saudi backing and Gulf Cooperation Council backing, and we're not having it. So they go and occupy Sana'a. Now what's significant about this is the troops around Sana'a are troops that were loyal to Ali Abdullah Saleh, who's still in Sana'a. And so it emerges later that he gave the word to allow the Houthis to come in. And they had secretly forged an alliance. Right, so here again, Saleh, from 2004 to 2010, is fighting the Houthis. Now they're allies. Right? They're allies because they're going to be allies against the Gulf Cooperation Council, and basically he wants to get back into power, and this is the way he sees he can do it. So it's the emergence of this Houthi-Saleh alliance. Iran, interestingly, has now, is sort of like, oh, maybe we can help you, Houthis, since we're all Shia now. No contact with Iran before. It's completely new. But they tell the Houthis not to take Sana'a, and they take it anyways, which is a sign of, the Iranians don't really have a whole lot of control. The Houthis, for their part, don't have a whole lot of friends right now. So they were probably very welcoming of this Iranian outreach because everyone else is allied with Saudi Arabia, and the United States is allied with Saudi Arabia. So they're, welcoming of that, but they're not really taking marching orders. So they declare that the parliament's dissolved, Hadi no longer has authority, he has to resign. Hadi resigns, and then he unresigns. It's a really detailed few days that take place in January. It's going to take, I didn't get to the January part. Okay, take place in January. January, there we are. So they force him to resign. He resigns, he comes back. By the spring, they're pushing south. So with Saleh and his loyal troops and the Houthis. And the Houthis have these militias and a lot of strength, but they don't know anything about governing, right? They've never really governed. So Saleh's like, I'm the governing guy, and so we can do this together. So they're very closely allied, but they keep their troops loyally separate. But they're starting to march south and taking more and more towns. And they get to Aden. There's a brief siege of Aden, and they get thrown out with the help of Saudi Arabia. Hadi, who's from the south but was loyal to Saleh, is now this sort of acting president, with Saudi and US backing, which I'll talk about in a minute. And so they begin launching to beef up the troops that are loyal to him, including Ali Mohsin, who's the cousin of Saleh, right? So it's a lot of all in the family going on here. And this is where you emerge what seems to be 2 blocks, the Houthis and Saleh in the north, and Hadi and the separatists, the southern separatists, with Saudi backing in the south. The separatists hate Hadi, even though he's from the south, because he supported the north in the war with the south. He was never in favor of succession. So every time that he shows up there, he's mostly in Saudi Arabia, he'll show up in Aden and be like, I'm in Yemen, see? And he's like, I gotta go, because he's, doesn't want to get assassinated. Every time he shows up, he's met with these massive demonstrations of Southerners carrying the flag before unification, which is to say, we want Southern independence. So it's a very strong message to him because he's not asking for Southern independence. And in March in this situation, in 2015, Saudi Arabia launches a war ostensibly to defeat Saleh and the Houthis, but in fact also to be intimately involved in the project of what comes next. Right? If they weren't involved, Hadi would likely fall, and then the Houthis and Saleh would have to fight it out for power. And Saudi Arabia does not want this. They want basically their guy to be the new president. And it's in this moment, from this fall, where the rhetoric about the Houthis being Iranian proxies it just blows up. And you heard it a lot in the United States. Every time I was in Washington giving a talk, people would say, yeah, but it's really about the Iranians, and Saudi Arabia has to fight the Iranians to keep them out of that part of the peninsula. And I was like, no, actually, that's not. And just to give an example, when I was living there in the 90s and 2000s, there were Zaydis and there were Sunnis, and you would pray together anywhere you prayed. And so I read in the newspaper in 2016 that a famous ancient Zaydi Shiite mosque had been bombed. And it's a mosque I know. I'm like, that's not a Shiite mosque. Like, why are you calling it a Shiite mosque? Well, in fact, over these 1.5 to 2 years, this whole idea of Sunnis versus Shia, the Zaydis, is becoming more real. And that's one of the big tragedies. Because of all this rhetoric that's being, these sort of kind of identity entrepreneurs, that they're saying, look, it's the Shias, the Iranians are coming, you have to fight with us. They're mobilizing people on that ground. It's becoming real. And it's becoming real in a tragic way. And so when I was talking to friends, asking about this Shia mosque, they're like, yeah, from like 18 months ago, it's been a Shia mosque, in fact. Right? And so that's all changed in a very tragic way, because it's very difficult to undo those kinds of divisions. So the war, there's absolutely terrible humanitarian crisis. The Saudi-led coalition controls the airspace and the ports, and nobody flies into Yemen or even Sana'a without Saudi approval. The very few journalists and humanitarian people go, all stop in Riyadh first and get vetted, and then they'll fly over. They'll bomb the airport so it's not effectively usable, and they block the ports to try to strangle the north. In part because, as I showed you with those roads, you can't just march on Sana'a. It's not easy to march up there. It's not easy to get weapons when you're fighting an army that has heavy weapons, right? So we're at a standoff where the Saudi coalition can't get to the north, but the north is not able also to push down. These were just the latest tragic figures. The city of Taiz is completely under siege. The hospitals are collapsed. There's a massive cholera outbreak. People are dying of asthma, of all kinds of very treatable things. But when you're malnourished, it's easy to die of very treatable things. On the brink of 7 to 8 million on the brink of famine, et cetera. And so it's largely this standoff. In that map of standoff, though, you do have these pockets of groups that are, stubbornly insisting to be non-aligned. This area called the Khawlan is like, we are not involved. Like, you can't move troops across our property. We're completely non-aligned. And the way that they're able to do that is pretty incredible. So moving things across land, you have to get permission every different tribal land you cross. And so they basically have negotiations and agreements, and they'll allow certain things to pass and other things they won't allow to pass. There's all kinds of fascinating stories about the creative ways people get money. One of the things they'll do is they'll sign up to join one side or another, and they'll get a uniform and get fed and take the guns and then disappear at night and then go sell the gun to someone else. Plus they got food for 3 days. It's really, things are really bad, and sort of the way in which people are finding ways to survive is pretty fascinating. So again, here we have the standoff. If you see, difficult taking the highlands. Saleh is assassinated just under a year ago. He is said to be fleeing Sana'a. We don't know the circumstances. This picture and pictures like it circulated widely. I blocked off the piece of his head that's missing because you don't need to see that, but the picture was important because it confirmed his death. People who wouldn't believe that he was actually dead, this is a photo that circulated that it's unquestionably him. And he did die, and he was killed by the Houthis. So his alliance with his former enemy, he made a misstep. And I can't say that surprises me, given that he killed their leaders and fought a war with them, that they're really going to have forgotten that. So they used him. But without him around, you still have this sort of significant militia and army in the north. So just to conclude with a couple things, and I'll talk about the role of the United States. I've sort of talked about these in my comments already, but these are two common assertions about the war that I think are wrong. The first is that it's a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran. First place, a proxy war is when a conflict is fought out by third parties on another land, right? Saudi Arabia is in the war. It's not a proxy. It's actively involved in the war. Iran is now trying to get aid to the Houthis, and the Houthis are trying to take that aid. Evidence is they haven't been very effective, but they've been intercepted a lot of efforts to get there. But they haven't seen the weapons that they're still finding. We have these great weapons experts that pore over, not me, they pore over photos that get uploaded online, and they can identify munitions and where things came from. So the munitions that they're using are still predominantly US munitions that were given to Ali Abdullah Saleh, or sold to Ali Abdullah Saleh by the United States, right? So the fact that we're not seeing Saudi munitions or other munitions or Chinese munitions tells us that the Iran is not really getting a whole lot of anything through, or we would start to see evidence of that. So that's one problem. It's not entire, they are involved, but it's a domestic conflict as well. The second one, which I've also, I hope, debunked, is that it's a Sunni-Shia conflict. The Zaidi alliances are all over the map. You have Zaidis on all sides, et cetera. But the tragedy is that you do, and you have long Saudi intervention, which goes even earlier than I gave you evidence for from the 60s. But the big, big tragedy is that, as I said, those sectarian identities are starting to become real. You see rhetoric on, graffiti in Arabic on the wall, against, Shia dogs. Dog is like the worst animal you could be. So just calling these really terrible derogatory names. And that was never there before. And that is emerging. It's there, right? And that's tragic because if and when the war stops, and I hope it does stop, you're now going to have to deal with that kind of divide. And as we know from our own country, other countries, once people really begin to hate the other and fear the other, it's not easy to get over that in a couple years. That's going to take a long, multi-generational building process to sort of get past that. And that's a big tragedy. And because that's that way, and because of now the hatred of the United States, which I'll talk about in a second, I don't know it'll be ever safe for me to go there, even if the war does end. Whereas I never felt any danger. I felt incredibly welcomed everywhere. If anything, I had too many invitations. I couldn't go to see everybody because I just would be having dinners every night. But now there's this animosity that's very real and hatred of the other that is very real. Let's see. 3 slides left. Okay. What is the role of the United States? So the United States, I argue, is a party to this war. We have not declared war on any country since World War II. So all the other wars that we have are just emergency exercises, police missions, aiding, et cetera. So the fact that we haven't declared this as war is irrelevant because we don't declare war anymore, except it's war on drugs and war on terror. We are a party to the war, right? We sell arms to Saudi Arabia and continue to sell them knowing how they're being used. We share intelligence with the Saudis of of particular locations, likely movements of troop in the north that US satellites and intel can provide. So we're giving them direct information about where and how to bomb and what to do. And more importantly, we're involved in mid-air refueling assistances for Saudi bombing missions, right? So we are aiding them mid-air, making it possible for them to fly longer distances to carry out bombing missions. To me, that sounds like involvement in a war. This is why you now have this tremendous animosity towards Americans in a way you didn't have when I was there before, because they see the United States is a party to the war. Well, I have 2 more slides, but if they come up in questions. I'll just end here. I hope I've sort of laid out the contours of where we're at. I haven't talked much about what's possible, what's next. So there's a growing movement in Congress to question our role in this war, led by Chris Murphy from Connecticut and several other representatives. And thus far, it hasn't been successful, but the last vote they took was about 40% of the House, which was significant from 2 years ago. It was about 15% of the House. We simply wanted to look into and question what we're selling to Saudi Arabia and our aid to Saudi Arabia, and saying that should be open to question. So it's possible that as this goes, that at some point it will be enough to force some kind of open debate and inquiry. And I think that could be tremendously important. The humanitarian issue is absolutely abhorrent. The Saudi Arabia is trying to choke the north by closing down the ports so that humanitarian aid can't get in. The humanitarian aid agencies are crying foul. I think more attention to this would be helpful. So I will give every talk, and I write op-eds, and any chance I can to talk to anybody, from you to people at the military academies that want to talk about anyone I'm happy to talk about with, because I just want it to be part of the conversation. I want people to be thinking about it. But there are ways in which public pressure could significantly affect the war. It's got to be addressed. The humanitarian crisis, it's just at catastrophe levels right now. Okay, well, I guess I'll end there on that positive note, which is atypical for me. But yes?
Jillian, you've clarified so many things for me, because I have been perpetuating the myth of the proxy war and really just didn't understand this. But 2 questions I have. Number 1, what is the Saudi stake in this? And 2, what is the Iranian stake in this?
So the Iranian stake, I think, is easier. I think the Iranian stake, the closest way likely to put it is simply to create pockets of allies where it can, right? They don't seem to have an expansionist agenda at the moment, an active expansionist agenda, the way they did immediately after the 1979 revolution, which they were actually funding more groups. Now they're reaching out funding still Hezbollah involved in Syria, but they seem to be just wanting, I'm trying to find the map here, to find, to help whatever allies they could help. That's my best for Iran.
Are they aiming against Iran?
Are who?
The Saudi, the Iranians,
Yeah.
rather, are against Saudi, rather.
Right, right.
They want to undermine the monarchy in Saudi, or?
I don't know that, I don't know. Possibly. I mean, that logic could make sense, but I don't think the Houthis have a viable chance of actually making that happen, more than just embarrassing the Saudis and, frustrating them on the war front. Because the Houthis are, a few thousand people. It's not a massive group. They have this wider support base, but the actual Houthis themselves, I don't think in any way could ever threaten Saudi Arabia.
But as I understand it, that Iran, because of its limited offensive capacity to launch wars,
right,
uses asymmetrical warfare to destabilize as much as they can their opponents. But this idea that Iran is going to invade Israel,
right. It's absurd, yeah.
Okay, so, but they see this as a way of undermining the Saudis. Okay, now as far as
the Saudi side.
The Saudi
You asked me
side,
what Saudis. What is Saudi?
Iranians and the Saudi monarchy? Is this an effort on their part to help undermine or limit the influence of the Saudi monarchy?
Again, I think it'd be limiting Saudi Arabia's influence, or to at least embarrass it, or to have a toehold there, in the only way it can. But I don't know. I have no. I just don't know what they're thinking. I can speculate what they're thinking, but I don't know what their objective is.
But I know, for example, that in 1979, the Saudi monarchs were our Saudi monarchy was very concerned about Khomeini and the idea of undermining monarchies that were, heretical, et cetera,
Right.
So,
for the same reason, this is why they didn't want United Yemen, because it was a Republican move that would potentially undermine the monarchies in the Gulf.
So that's the Iranian state.
Right.
What about the Saudi state?
So again, I don't know what the Saudis are thinking, so we can only speculate. And sort of my friends that are Saudi experts don't all agree. But these are the clusters of arguments that come. One is we just don't want a strong, united Republican state there, right? So that's been the story of destabilizing Yemen all along, is to prevent a strong, united Yemen, one. The second one, which I find quite compelling, is We don't actually care so much what happens on the western part of the country, except we don't want a government that hates us, right? So we don't really want a government that dislikes us there. But we really want to build a pipeline through the eastern part to the desert, to the sea.
Who does? United States?
The Saudi Arabia.
When you say we, who is we?
We, Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia, again, I don't know what Saudi Arabia, I don't know what Mohammed bin Salman is thinking. You know, we can only speculate what some of the logic could be. One of the logics is we've always wanted, so Saudi Arabia, I have this pedagogical thing that we to make the argument in first person, so I'll try not to do that. Saudi Arabia has always wanted a weak Yemen, has done everything to weaken Yemen and destabilize it for decades, particularly after unification. Unification made them completely nervous, and I know this from Saudi experts that tell me they were talking about it, panicking about it, like, oh my God, we can't have this. The other speculation is that Saudi Arabia would like to build a pipeline from some of its oil fields down to either Mukalla or to create an entirely new port, right, which could be a faster route for them to get oil to export.
So they wouldn't have to go through.
Well, they have multiple ports, but that would be a quicker, for oil fields over here, that would be a quicker route. I don't know of any evidence that we're absolutely confident that that's what they're thinking. But it certainly comes up a lot in conversations, and some of my Saudi experts friends think that that's the big reason. Is it's not, like, why do we care about Yemen? Can't just be we don't like Yemen. And that's one of the reasons they think they really would like to build a pipeline through the eastern part of the country.
Do they think that would be safer than taking it down to the Persian Gulf?
I don't know, again, I don't know what they're thinking. I mean, it would be a shorter, for some of the oil fields, it would be a shorter distance.
Would it be strategic to maintain some type of control over the western part of that country so that the flow of oil would be unimpeded?
Yeah, I think that would make sense. I mean, there's not oil in Yemen anymore. It's gone.
But the flow is
But right, to flow through there. And they're very concerned about the ports. And so one of the things is this island here, Socotra, which is a piece of Yemen, spectacularly beautiful, that the United Arab Emirates have decided they're developing, right? Because there's no standing government. They're building hotels and stuff that are going to open not for several years, but they're building a port.
Where is this, that little island?
This island right here, Socotra. It's actually closer. I mean, it's not really close. It's closer to parts of Africa. You can't really tell. I can show you the map later. So one of the concerns for the Gulf in general, not just Saudi Arabia. So the United Arab Emirates is also involved in this conflict. But I've left a bit of the, because I don't want to give you too many names and pieces. I just want to give you the big pieces. But there's a great concern about controlling the ports. And so they had been building up these massive port infrastructures on the Arabian Peninsula, on the eastern part. Bahrain, Qatar, the Emirates, all of the Gulf states have been building these massive port infrastructures. By one count, FedEx in Kuwait had 70,000 FedEx employees, right? Because it's a logistics firm for shipping things, for moving things. So one of the arguments is as the oil runs out, I mean, these oil countries know the oil's going to run out. It's not news to them. So they're trying to figure out what to do. One of the things they're trying to do is to lock down this massive port infrastructure for stuff coming from Singapore and Malaysia to pass through, which are actually ancient trade routes anyways. So part of the thought is, like, we just need to control the south and the pipeline, but we don't want in the highlands these, people who are going to wage war on us periodically. So that's one of the arguments. But again, I always caution because we don't know what they're thinking. I don't have inside information what they're actually trying to accomplish. I can simply see what they're doing and see the logic, different kinds of logics at work, and that would be one. But there's a very strong UAE presence in Mukalla, and Aden, of course, is and has always been a prize. Yeah.
The U.S.
Yes.
and the U.S. interest?
Well, the U.S., our interest is in supporting Saudi Arabia as our ally in the region. We have multiple permanent bases in Saudi Arabia. The Fifth Fleet is either in Bahrain or Qatar. Our U.S. Central Command is in one of the, I forget which one's in Qatar and which one's in Bahrain, But the U.S. Central Command, permanent bases there. So it's militarily, we have permanent, massive bases in Saudi Arabia and all those Gulf countries. So, even before the current president, our priorities have been our security interest. So we look the other way for repressive regimes when we get enough out of them. And in these cases, there are these permanent bases.
But given the regional nature of the conflict, as well as you mentioned earlier, the domestic conflict aspect of it, and then you talked about what the U.S. could do in the congressional
Right.
inquiries, wouldn't it be that even if the U.S. were to have congressional inquiries, and even if we were therefore not to do all of the things that we're doing to support the Saudis in their intervention, that the likelihood is that this conflict is going to continue?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's very likely that it will continue. And it'll continue not just, Saudi Arabia is hurting from it. It's costing them a tremendous amount of money, and they're not making any gains. So one idea is at one point that might not be the calculus. But you have this young crown prince, so Mohammed bin Salman, the king has Alzheimer's or is not effectively functioning. So the crown prince is really running the country, and he has this idea of he's going to change the country, right? And he's very bold in doing it. And I think his hubris in this act isn't going to go away. I think he's not going to want to lose this, but he's not going to win this way, right? You're basically going to see the population die off in massive percentages, and that will be the victory. And I think that's what's going to happen. But given that that's what's going to happen, we still can't just throw up our hands. We have to say, what can we do? And even under Obama, there was so little pressure on Saudi Arabia to stop. This started in 2015, right? So this isn't a Trump administration thing. This was a US administration thing. I'm going to remind people that because they'll say, oh, well, Trump loves Saudi Arabia. It's like, well, Obama loved Saudi Arabia too. Not with same rhetoric, but it was very much the same policies that were happening. Yeah?
What humanitarian groups are trying to get in there, and are any being successful?
Yeah, intermittently they are successful, yeah. But, so part of the thing is to get transit through, you have to peel off part of your goods to get somewhere, or people aren't going to let you pass. So very little actually gets where it needs to go, and then the governments so the humanitarian groups want to distribute aid directly, but they won't get permission to always distribute it directly. It's like, well, let me distribute it for you, and well, we know who's gonna get it then. It's like, my guys are gonna get it, or I'm gonna sell it, right? So there's these ongoing problems, and there's so little accountability and monitoring, and it's just not safe. So, you can, I follow, I forget the acronym, the UN group that's in charge of aid, Médecins Sans Frontières, does aid missions there. There's a lot of groups that are trying to get in, but nobody gets in without Saudi permission. And Saudi Arabia wants to choke the North, and this is one of the ways they want to choke the North, to make the humanitarian situation so bad that people will rise up against the Houthis or whomever out of desperation, but they're dying instead. Yeah?
I'm struck that this story reminds me of Syria, but I've heard much more of Syria than I've heard of this Yemen conflict. And it sounds like the Saudis, in keeping the information quiet, are fueling it, because once the information got out about Syria, the conflict didn't stop, but people are aware of it, talking
Right.
about it, pressuring their own government. It sounds to me like we should pressure Saudi Arabia to let reporters in, or let the conflict be known.
Right. Well, some people do get in. Vice did a documentary that they smuggled people in, including a friend of mine, which I didn't know. And then I was watching this Vice documentary, and I'm like, oh my God, it's Peter. But I did just talk to him, so I knew he got out okay. But I had no idea. And they came in from Somalia on a little boat and docked in Aden. And so there are tiny bits that can get in that way. They were doing a documentary, but there are tiny bits that can get in that way. But they need caravans on caravans of aid to help. Plus, the infrastructure is completely destroyed. So Sana'a is an open sewage pit because the sewages have been blown up in the bombing. And that's why there's cholera and all kinds of other problems. And that's not going to be easy to repair. Even if in good times, to get that equipment and to get that kind of infrastructure into the highlands, it has to be basically flown in because you can't get it up the mountains. It's going to be a long process. And so people are just living in this very little electricity in the capital. There's always been rolling blackouts in the capital, but instead of like rolling periods where you lose electricity for 4 or 5 hours a day, now you get electricity for 2 or 3 hours a day, right? It's just, it's absolutely just devastating.
So Saudi Arabia just wants this country destroyed because for no reason whatsoever other than if you're unstable, you could make us unstable, and we don't want to be unstable. So we're gonna
Right.
choke and kill everybody because we can't get to you because your infrastructure or your regions are mountainous and you have the high ground. We can't get up there. But if we bomb you, then the whole world will look at us like, oh, that's horrible because you're bombing the people in the highland. So why don't we just starve you all and kill you all while the world looks at whatever else?
Everything else, yeah. And you're talking in Saudi Arabia, I love it.
But the Saudis want the ports, though, right?
The Saudis want the
They
ports.
don't want the rest of it. Damn it, because the ports is what.
Right.
But they only want the ports on the eastern side.
Well, also, and down here, and then Hodeidah, which is an important port, going up the coast till you hit the other ports, the
so
Saudi
they're
ports.
not interested in occupying.
No,
They don't want to live there.
no.
They just want to run pipes through.
Again, I don't know the logic of what they're thinking, because from, the way my brain works is like, this is creating animosity towards Saudi Arabia. Like, why not fund it and help develop it, and people will be grateful to Saudi Arabia for ushering it into a better land? But that's not the way they're thinking. So I'm always cautious to say that I know what they're thinking. I can think through the logics of it, but they have tried to destabilize Yemen over the decades consistently to keep it weak. So I think they see this possibly as a chance to maybe win.
And we help Saudi Arabia because why?
Because we have permanent bases there, and it's our major ally in the region. And we sell it billions of dollars of arms. But we have permanent bases. They're not just parking our planes there. There are whole plots of land that are sovereign US land, the same way an embassy is sovereign land for that country. That's US soil, and there's massive chunks of these bases that are there. There's cities of the people that staff these bases. I mean, cities. Yes?
How much of this can stem from the Sunni versus Shiite versus, along with Saudi Arabia versus Iran?
So I think some of those conflicts are real, but I don't think that's the core of what the conflict is about. I think you have two factors. You have a domestic power struggle that's been going back decades, that overthrowing Saleh and who's going to rule next. So that's really a domestic power struggle, combined with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf that wants to shape the region the way it wants to be shaped, and the US wants to support Saudi Arabia. And you have a very real clash between Iran and Saudi Arabia. It's not to say that they're not enemies. They're very much antagonistic towards each other. But Yemen isn't at war simply for that reason. That's a sort of outside piece of it, of the picture. Yes?
Do you think that's U.S. propaganda, the Saudi Arabia?
Yeah, well, it's not just U.S. propaganda. I mean, it's Saudi propaganda, it's Gulf propaganda. So a lot of the think tanks that write policy pieces are funded with Gulf money in Washington, and so they're writing very pro-Gulf positions. I'm actually a non-resident senior fellow for the Atlantic Council, which is a security council, and has some Saudi money for the Rafi Hariri Center, which is the Middle East Center, as part of it. And when they asked me to write, they're like, we want you to write on Yemen and be a non-resident senior fellow. I'm like, have you read stuff I've written? And they're like, yeah, that's okay. I'm like, okay, but I'll write for you, but I'm going to say what I want to say. And if I feel you're tampering it down, I'm going to make a big stink of it. I'm going to let people know that you're not letting me say what I say. And they have let me say what I want to say.
What did you say?
I say everything I've said here. I mean, I'm pointing out the constantly talk about the humanitarian crisis. I talk about the direct US role, which people think we're just, Saudi Arabia's an ally, so we're helping a little. It's like, no, our planes are going up and making bombing missions possible. So I write about those kinds of things whenever I have extra time. And I haven't been censored yet. But those are often platforms for the pro, the Iranian boogeyman. Yes, we have to do this. It's unfortunate. They're also, you get a lot of that. And in Washington, that's the narrative that's most easily embraced. It's also, it's a complicated conflict. It's not impossible to understand. But with that, and there's a war in Yemen, or in Syria, and Libya too. We don't even talk about Libya. Libya is not a viable state at the moment. There's so much noise out there that I think people, it's like, oh, okay, I got it. That's what that's about. It's easy to latch on to the simplistic narrative. And again, it's not that that isn't a piece of it, but that's not even half of it. Yes, sir.
What do I know about Yemen? And you glossed over it. If there wasn't a war going on there, they wasted all their water that they had above ground. They dug wells, they've gone down too deep, and there's no water resources there.
Right, but it's
So they would be in very bad shape.
They were in very bad shape. Absolutely, they were terrible. It's the poorest country in the region. It has the worst literacy rates. It's largely rural. There's very few. It might be the only country in the region that's still largely rural because urbanization has been so important. The infrastructure is terrible. There's not electricity in huge parts of the country. I was there for the elections in 1997, and they ran out of ballots. And somebody's like, "Well, just Xerox some more ballots." And they're like, "Okay, we don't have a Xerox machine, but we don't even have electricity if we had a Xerox machine." So they had to figure out what to do. So yes, it's a very poor, impoverished country anyways. They didn't waste water so much as there just isn't enough renewable water. They're tapping into non-renewable groundwater, and there's not enough for the people. The people is too high of a population for the water that was available there. But Saudi Arabia could be, for example, providing desalinization plants and other kinds of things to stabilize and help the population, but it's not doing any of that. Yeah.
I was curious as to how you personally, if you're willing to be comfortable sharing, how you ended up as a Yemen.
Sure, yeah. So I was working, I was doing my dissertation, and I wanted to write on something in the Middle East, and I went to Cairo in 1991 for an immersion Arabic program, because it's one of the best programs that's out there. And the Egyptian dialect is really specific. And so tons of people do research. They go there and they learn the dialect in Egyptian dialect, and then they just stay on to do their dissertations. So to leave and go and learn another dialect is a huge undertaking. But I was interested in questions of, but my dissertation that became the book, my first book was about Islamic political parties, Islamic groups that enter elections for the first time. Like, how do they negotiate that? Do they disagree internally? Do they fight with each other? How do you do that? You're like, we're going to participate in elections now. And Yemen and Jordan both had that situation almost within a year of each other, but very different countries in other ways. So I went to Yemen, which everybody said, oh, it's the Wild West there. And then Jordan, which everyone calls the Hashemite kingdom of boredom, because if you're from Cairo or Jerusalem or Beirut or Damascus, these massive cities with this long history going back centuries and millennia, actually, it's spectacular. And Amman, downtown Amman, it was a Roman city. It was actually the city of Philadelphia in downtown Amman. But it was not a permanent settlement. Even in 100 years ago, there wasn't a permanent, not in the 1900, the turn of the 20th century, there was not a permanent settlement there. So it's just this dusty outpost. So it doesn't have an old, beautiful downtown because it's all new. So everybody disparages Jordan. But I went for those topics, and it ended up being spectacularly great as a tactic, besides the fact that I got to live in Yemen in particular. Is just I could go on forever. I love that country. I love the people there. Nobody was doing research there. So I would show up, and anyone would talk to me, because they're like, oh my God. And I was Doctora Juliana. When we're taught here, you don't take titles that you haven't earned yet. So I'm like, I'm not Doctora, but they were just promoting you because you were the Western researcher coming to study. And you got to meet everybody. And you get a phone number. People give you phone numbers for cell phones. Like here, you don't give someone's personal cell phone without checking with them, right? You wouldn't just give away people's cell phones. And there they do. And so I was calling the prime minister to try to make an appointment to meet with him. And I think it's the office. And I'm like, he's like, I can't meet you. I'm like, well, I'm just trying to set up an appointment. And I'm talking to the prime minister, who picked up the phone. It was his cell phone. Right? So I got to talk to everybody. So it was great research, whereas in Egypt, there's like 30 PhD students every year doing something on politics, not now. And you know, they would complain like, nobody will return our call because they're flooded with researchers every year. Like I'm writing about Islam and democracy, or women in democracy, or women, Islam and democracy. You know, they're like the same things. And the same thing with Jordan. So few people were working on it. It was just really great access. And the groups I work with, the Muslim Brotherhood in both countries, I got to know them and their families, and I spent holidays with them, and I would just basically hang out in their offices in the library. For one of them in Yemen, I organized the library for them because they just had stacks of stuff. And they're like, it's a mess, but you can go ahead. I was like, okay. So I organized it for them. And of course, I found all this crazy stuff that they didn't even know they had, which was great for me. But I just had this, you know, tremendous access because so few people were there. And Yemenis are just extraordinarily welcoming. And most Yemenis don't speak English. So it was a great place to work on your Arabic because everybody's super patient with you. Usually if I'm struggling along and someone's, back in the 90s, if you're struggling along and someone speaks English better, they're just like, can we just speak English? Okay. You know, because it's work. But there, no one did. So we'd sit and have these long conversations, and it was so rich for me in that regard. But I haven't been since 2002 to Yemen. I go to Jordan all the time. My book now is on Jordan that I'm finishing up. And I hope I'll be able to go back one day in my life, but I don't think this war is going to end soon, and I don't think it'll be safe for me to go. And that makes me very sad. Not for me, for the reasons why I can't go.
You know, I'm old enough to remember the Nixon administration, where he used to talk
I
about
remember it too.
the two cops on the beat, Iran under the Shah, and of course Saudi Arabia. Now, of course, Iran's out of that picture. But I just don't understand, it's mind-boggling for me, that we keep thinking that Saudi is going to provide some sort of stability or whatever, and you know how duplicitous they are with Wahhabism, with support of Al-Qaeda, etc. How do we keep this faith? And I think others have expressed this as well in this country that is playing its own game, and now, of course, finds itself in jeopardy, and has Prince Mohammed, who's trying to, at the last minute, revolutionize the country, allowing women to drive, which is shocking, the radicalization there. But why do we have this naivete about Saudi? I just don't understand.
Well, I share that. I don't understand the logic of it, except that I think it's the road we're on. We have the bases there. It's hard to shift. Hard to say, oh, we're going to dismantle these bases and then put them where. I think we're in bed with it, and there's a momentum to it. There's deep relationships that aren't just government. They're military relationships. There's industrial, exactly. All kinds of business relationships. There's all kinds of layers there that you can't just shift. And I think that's one of the things like Obama found out, that he was going to try to change some of these relations, and he found they were just not easy to change. We're going to hold Saudi Arabia more accountable for human rights, but you can't really just do that.
And clearly the sale of arms to Saudi Arabia is another incentive.
Huge. Yeah, and the thing is, Saudi Arabia buys arms from us. We sell arms a lot, but we also give arms to a lot of countries, right? But they're buying them from us. And the other thing the other part of foreign aid, which we're not giving assistance aid to Saudi Arabia, but like to Egypt, is a lot of the aid that's where we're giving them discounts or food, et cetera, is U.S. money that's not going to Egypt. It's not going to Jordan. It's going to the United States, to our farmers to sell grain to ship over there, or our consultants to go over there. So that money, a lot of the aid, it's a sort of, people don't realize, not all of it, but there are direct cash transfers, but a lot of aid is spent in the United States. So if you cut aid to a country, you're also cutting millions of dollars that are being spent in the United States for the military-industrial complex, obviously, but our farmers. The amount of wheat that we ship to Egypt is phenomenal. And so we're paying farmers to make wheat subsidized as aid. So there's all kinds of...
We're subsidizing our economy via foreign aid.
Right, in part, yeah, absolutely. And so like in, not to switch countries, but in 2013, there was a coup in Egypt, right? You had Morsi, who was elected president, and then the army took him out. According to Congress, if there's a coup, we have to immediately suspend our aid to the country until we determine whether this was legitimate or not. This is why like nobody in the White House, including Obama, would call it a coup. Because if you call it a coup, you have to suspend aid, and nobody wanted to suspend aid or military relations. So they kept saying, the Morsi is not there anymore. It's like you look at the, there's actually an article I read where someone looked at the rhetoric, and it's like so awkward and pained. It's like, don't say it, don't say what it is, because it was a coup.
You know, I mean, I think the term the labyrinth of mirrors for the Middle East is appropriate because, you know, we read about all kinds of backdoor deals.
Right.
The United States backdoor discussions with Iran and all in terms of selecting a prime minister and government for Iraq.
Right.
And it's truly amazing. But you know, I hope that when you finish your book on Jordan,
I'll be done in 2 weeks, actually.
In 2 weeks.
Almost done.
Because you know, I thought today was different from a lot of our talks. It was more like a seminar. And the
Was that good?
percentage of
I
the
hope.
audience who participated is much higher, I think, because of the way you conducted this. And I really appreciate it.
I think somebody over here had a question.
Oh, yeah, right here, yes.
Hadi, where is he at?
So he is mostly in Riyadh, you know, and this picture of him, just because I like to hate on Hadi. No, but there's besides me being snarky. So he's in Saudi Arabia. He goes to Aden once in a while. Okay. Just think of the image of the children that I showed you. He constantly shows up with his like buttons busting at the seams. And I just find it like, as your country starves, it's so like offensive. So he shows up periodically in Aden for a few days usually, and then leaves because he's not safe there. Aden itself, you know, like there's all these separatist groups, but in parts of Aden, Al-Qaeda has a stronghold in certain neighborhoods of Aden. ISIS is a little bit out, although they might, I heard like a few months ago that was mostly done, so I don't know how much they're still there. But it's not like a stable sovereign city. It's a city under siege by a bunch of different groups who decides what they're gonna do. Nobody's taking order from anyone else, right? They're not taking orders from him. And so he goes in there periodically, but he's not based there in any real sense. And then he shows up looking, you know. Yeah, but I mean, it's not surprising for this type of person, but like as your country's literally starving, I just like, it makes me so upset. I mean, he makes me upset anyways, but it just makes me like, it's so deeply offensive to me.